welcome to Bronco Book Lover. I'm Leslie and Murray. Today we have Sidik Fofana.
Yeah.
Of the short story collection, Stories from the Tenant Downstairs. I'm going to read you a brief bio. Sidik is a graduate of NYU MFA program and a public school teacher in Brooklyn. His work has appeared in the Swan Review and Granter. He has also named a fellow for the Center of Fiction in 2018. Stories from the Tenant Downstairs is his debut collection composed of 8 narratives about residents of a fictional building in Harlem. Sidik, welcome to Bronco Book Lover.
Oh, thank you, Leslie Ann. It's a pleasure to be here. So amped for this conversation.
Great. So, Sidik, tell us about your collection.
It was 15 years in the making. I was writing separate short stories at first. I didn't know that it would come together to be a cohesive collection where characters are meeting each other, are dipping in each other's lives. I didn't know that. I was just writing separate short pieces and also thinking about gentrification, thinking about Black vernacular, thinking about American vernacular, and the ways that people are playful with language when speaking. And so, it just kind of came together after a decade and a half, which I'm embarrassed to say, a decade and a half to write a book, but it wasn't like every single day for a decade and a half. I did take some like breaks to work on other projects, but it took a really, really long time. And I'm scared now because I'm like, is it really going to take me 15 years to do a book? But it's been a cool process.
Yeah. How did it take so long? And what were you doing in the interim?
Yeah, no. I think the first major realization I had was making, like, is this a book? I started writing. My creative outlet of choice was not fiction. And my creative outlet of choice was hip hop. So from the ages of 8 to 22, like I was writing hip hop verses. And then from like 21, 22, that's when I started getting interested in contemporary fiction. So starting at 22, the first 5 years were like, I need to learn this.
Yeah.
You start off at 21, 22 reading something and you're like, that's easy. I could do that. And then you start to do it and you're like, whoa, no, this is hard. This is something I need to learn.
Absolutely.
So that first 5 years was learning. The second 5 years was like, does this become, like, how does this become a book? It started off like learning how to write short stories individually. And then, people tend to write across themes and revisit certain, themes in their work. And so when I thinking about that, I was just like, oh, I'm interested in similar things in these stories and how can these stories link? So it wasn't until 6, 7 years in where I was just like, oh, I have a book. Now let me just like write towards that. And then the last 5 years were like certain stories just took a really, really long time. Say short stories and I want to feel like it's like, it'll take as long as the length and not as long as a novel, but sometimes short stories take longer than novels because you just got to figure out what's going on, what world you want to portray and how to portray it as like concisely as possible.
Yeah. And you know what? Like, I'm glad I'm asking you this question about like why it took so long, because I think sometimes we need to demystify the writing process and the publishing process. So many times we think, oh, we have a book idea, we're going to write this book idea, and therefore it's going to be a book, right? And there's so much learning in that process that you have to do, especially what time you come to that writing. It takes a lot, especially if you have kids, if you have a partner, if you have all these things, if you have a W-2 form job, like all those things contribute, and I think it's important to demystify that process and, like let everyone know, like everyone is at a different length in their writing career, a different race, a different level, you know? And that's important to see, know, and hear.
So true. So true.
You mentioned Juno Diaz just now, and I think when
Mhm.
I'm reading your collection, I keep thinking about Juno Diaz as one of your inspiration and Gloria Naylor, the woman of Brewster.
Mhm.
Can you tell us how they contributed to your book and your writing process?
Oh yeah, definitely. You know, I call those authors like the literary DNA. Like I have my favorite authors,
Mhm.
but like if you look at their books and look at what I'm writing, it'd be hard to be like, oh, there's an influence on. Like, you know, I like, um, you know, Jose Saramago, Blindness, and he's more speculative, and so
Mhm.
it's like kind of hard to see that in my work. But there's certain writers where you're like, oh, you were reading them and you were biting them, you know, like, and so it's you know, Juno Diaz, definitely just the idea of like you could just write like
Mhm.
from the block, you know, like
Yeah.
you could just write. That's American too.
Yeah.
That's a form of writing too. It doesn't have to be F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
You could just write like the witty dude that's from the inner city.
Yeah.
um Gloria Naylor, like the concept of um people being in a building and
Mhm.
each person having a story. Like that goes to Gloria Naylor's Woman of Brewster Place. That also goes to Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, even though it's not a
Mhm.
building, it's all people in the same place.
Yeah.
And so it's a tradition. It's a rich tradition that I wanted to kind of be in conversation with as well. Another person definitely was Sapphire,
Mhm.
Pushed by Sapphire, which takes place in Harlem. And it's interesting because Sapphire was a New York City public school teacher. And I think as a New York City public school teacher, you're in tune to people's stories and how they tell them.
Mhm.
And a lot of people tell stories accidentally, like they're venting and their story comes out.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things I appreciate as being a public school educator is that people tell their stories, and it's such a diversity of voices, and so all of that really contributed to what I was writing. You know, I was definitely aware of their influence as I was writing.
How do you craft such distinct and reverberating voices?
Mm, mm. I don't know. It's a lot of trial and error. It's a lot
Mhm.
of trial and error. You know, like growing up, you know, I didn't grow up in Harlem. I grew up in Boston. I grew up in you know, the inner city of Boston. And Boston's a weird city
Mhm.
because when you think of Boston, people think of this milky white city, you know?
Mhm.
And so I remember when I went to school in New York, I would say Boston like how people would say like Brownsville. You know,
Yeah.
like I would say like they would like because the Boston I knew was very black and very
Yeah.
like intimidating. So people would
Mhm.
be like, "Where are you from?" I was like, "I'm from Boston." But then I noticed that like, oh no, that it doesn't mean the same thing. And so
Mhm.
like I grew up in the inner city. I grew up, um, you know, like a 10-minute walk from Malcolm X's old house.
Mm.
And so like a lot of the voices that I'm hearing growing up are the same, you know, they have similarities to like people I met in Harlem, people I've lived with and whatnot. And so there's certain voices that even though they're a little bit removed from my experience, I know very well because I'm
Mhm.
around them. Like, and so naturally the voice that like I know the best is like Swan, the okey doke,
Mhm.
the young
Mhm.
man who's like, yo, my dude came home on the 4th. We trying to
Mhm.
celebrate him. Like that, I know that
Mhm.
voice. And then I also know the voice very well of Mimi, like
Mhm.
the young woman who's like you know, trying to make ends meet, who's sassy, but it comes from a place of like strength and defending herself. And so I've definitely heard that voice a lot. And in the classroom, I'll go to school tomorrow and hear that voice. And so those are the two voices where I was like, all right, I feel comfortable writing. Again, nothing's perfect, but I feel comfortable trying it. And then, I think one of the issues that popped up was like, well, how can I differentiate voices? Because we talk about like American vernacular and Black vernacular, and there are some commonalities. There are some things where you're like, all right, you can read a sentence, hear a voice, hear a turn of phrase, and be like, yo, as a person of color, But then within that experience, there's all these other different voices as well. And so I was like, all right, how can I like make them different? Because not everybody talks like Mimi, not everybody talks like Swan. And so on the page, I was like, all right, let me do some tangible things that could so one of the tangible things were like, I could have some people who curse and some people who don't curse. So like, Swan is the heaviest cursor. Mimi kind of cursed, Derry kind of cursed, but then someone like Mr. Murray or like Nisha, they don't really curse like that. And then another thing, I was like, you know what? In terms of how their words are portrayed on the page, like in terms of the phonetic pronunciation, I could just kind of, do some things with that. So there are people who, speak without the like instead of ing, it's the in.
Yeah.
And then there are some people who are like not speaking, but they're writing, and they might have some trouble with literacy. And so that's like someone like Naji.
Yeah.
And then also there are people who are very prim and proper. I think the tenant association ladies are more proper. Nisha's more proper. And so it's a lot of things that I had to consider. And I remember the late great Randall Keenan, I had a workshop with him, and we were talking about in class, like even ing, like whether you put apostrophe or whether you don't. And I made a purposeful choice not to put an apostrophe, because apostrophe politically means that there's something missing. And like the characters don't know that the G is missing.
Yeah.
But the characters do know. It's just that the pronunciation might have a little bit more of an authentic like pronunciation if the G was kind of left out. But it was a lot of just like seeing who curses, who doesn't, who writes a certain way, what are people's political views, how angry are they versus like, so it was a lot of those things were factored.
And how, when you're factoring these things, right, and you're thinking about voice and characters, how do you also think about like not like leaning into caricature? Because then that can become something as well, right? Like you're writing these people, but then you can lean into caricature and take away the agency that was like originally intended. So how do you balance all those things?
Yeah, it's tough. It's a tightrope, and it's a lot, there's a lot at stake. As a writer of color, if you're portraying character that's on the outs, it's like, what type of narrative are you perpetrating? Are you perpetuating? Like, and I feel like there's a trend in fiction where authenticity in fiction is like autobiography. Like if you like have a certain character that's like you, that has lived where you have lived, that has grown up how you have grown up, then you have an authentic stamp of approval. But fiction is not always like about that. People, fiction is like stepping in somebody else's shoes, and seeing what it's like. And so I kind of have like an insider outsider thing in that like these are composites of people I grew up with who are like friends, who are family, extended family, but they're not me, you know, they're not me. And so whenever someone does something wrong, or whenever someone has like, there's a kind of stereotypical cloud looming over them, like, I'm like, yes, this person is not me, but how would I act if that were me? And so the situations are other people, but the feelings, how they feel about certain things are me. And at the end of the day, you know, that's I just walk the rope and try to do the best I can, because there are characters, you know, who they're people, they're characters who are characters, and they're like stereotypes about people, especially Black people, that you have to be aware of, and then you have to subvert. And that's the thing.
I'm a contradiction. I'm a performer and a monk. And I observe in like social settings, you're very polite, but you're very shy. Right. And how do you
Yeah.
navigate both of those worlds, being
Mhm.
this writer who is influential, who is well known, and also being a monk at the same time?
Yeah. No, great question. Thank you for asking me that. You know, some people will read that and then they'll like shy away from asking me that. But like I love to be asked that question. Um, you know, I think it's I'm still learning how to do it, you know. A lot of it is just like I'm cut off from social media. Um and so, you know, I love talking about the book and going to events, but you know, I don't do too many events. And it's just the same way. I'm the same way at work. Like like being in front of the class is a performance. You know, it's like, and you know this as an educator, like it's a performance, and so a lot of it is like you conserve your energy, you're really, really quiet, and then you conserve that like performative energy for when you need it, you know? And so, you know, I have period 3 and I am like in the teacher's lounge watching my judge shows quietly. and then and then fourth period, I'm like, take a huge breath. Welcome, boys and girls. So great to see you. When just 5 minutes ago, I was just like really, really chill. And so I think being an author is just a psychological roller coaster. It really is, because there's an urge. Anyone, well, I'm not gonna say anyone, I'll speak for myself. When you're writing something on the page, you want people to read it. You want people to read it and say, like, this is cool and whatnot. But then there's a part of you that also just wants the privacy. You know, there's you know, there have been times where like I've been approached at a conference and people have said like really, really nice things and whatnot. I'm like, yo, this is cool. And then at the same time, I've been like, I couldn't do this every day though. Like I just want to be in a computer room and just like, you know, check my email. And so it's just that balance of just wanting to be public and then also just wanting to be private. And it's just like, it's a contradiction. It really is, because if I just wanted to be a shy, private person, then I would have just shown my stories to friends, you know, like, and you know, when we connected for this conversation, if I was a shy person, I would have been like, no, thank you, like, you know. But I like doing this. I like doing this, and so it's like just navigating that contradiction. You know, I am the type of person, like my mother's like this. I can barely look people in the eye sometimes, and so but I'm working through it.
Yeah. It was so amazing when I saw you at Lamplight. You were like so bombastic on the stage. And I was just like, oh my God, I have to read this collection. I need to meet this person. Then you came up and I'm like, you're like, all right. And I recognize that, right? You see it, I recognize it because I can be like that as well. But yeah, I totally understand this idea of like it's a contradiction, but it's like it's who you are, right? And we're all full of contradictions and none. I have
Mhm,
two
mhm.
more questions.
This is
What
fun.
are two takeaways you would like readers to know and feel about your book, your short story collection?
Oh, yeah, no, I would just want them to kind of look at the collection as not necessarily um like look at a collection as like an American collection,
Mhm.
like and not necessarily as like marginalized voices. Like I feel like the New York City apartment building, no matter what color the tenants are going through similar issues.
Yeah.
College, recent college grads are going through the situation. There's all kinds of people who are in high rises sprinkled throughout the city who have their own story to tell.
Mhm.
And the other takeaway is that like there are many, 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 many stories to tell. There are infinite stories to tell. And, sometimes like in my head, especially as I teach essays and we talk about like having a counter argument, addressing the counter argument. There are many times where like I think of the counter argument to to like to my book and I like come up with the answer. And so one of the counter arguments is like, man, why'd you take these stories? Why'd you take these stories to tell? Man, you took these stories. And then, my counter argument to that is like, um, I chose 8 residents who told you one story of their life.
Mhm.
Derry told one story.
Mm.
Derry has 100 stories.
Yeah.
Like, Candice has 100 stories.
Yeah.
And then there's 8 stories in this, and there's hundreds of people in this building.
Mhm.
And so each of those people have hundreds and hundreds of stories. And so, for those people who are like, why'd you take these stories? Like, I'm like, don't concentrate on those 8.
Mhm.
There's like 1,000. There's 1,000. And so, yeah, that's the other takeaway is that like this is just the smidgen of the stories out there, and that there are lots and lots to be told.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I
Hmm.
I think also it just leans in. It reminds me to be empathetic and understanding of like there's so many stories. Like when you meet a person, or you see one story, especially if it's a negative encounter. But there's so many stories happening with them for us to see, and to just be graceful at times in
Most
that
definitely.
process. So part of like our theme this year is about creating. Sadiq, thank you
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
much
Yeah.
for joining me in this conversation. I really appreciate you. I appreciate this conversation and your short story collection.
Thank you, Leslie Ann. This was great. I had
This was
fun.
awesome.